Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. I'm Rebecca Bell-Chambers, and this week's episode is called Euro 7 Announcement Explained. Here with me is today's guests, Michael Southcott, Associate Manager within Automotive Propulsion Component Research, and Kartik Ganesh, Automotive Propulsion Senior Research Analyst. Welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Rebecca.
Thanks, guys. So as we all know, in the last couple of days, we've finally had the Euro 7 announcements for the restrictions and the guidelines. So I thought today would be a good episode to discuss what this means, what's entailed in the regulations and things like that. So Mike, can you start us off by giving us an introduction to Euro 7 and maybe some background context?
Yeah, sure can. So I think your phrase there for me of finally been announced is the key one. I remember doing some research around before the COVID pandemic around when we expected Euro 7 to be coming in and what we expected of the emission standards back in 2019. So lots has happened since then, and lots has probably altered the necessity of what we wanted to achieve from Euro 7 as an industry. So I think way back then, and even in the earlier this year, there was talk that Euro 7 was going to be very stringent. It was going to really bring NOx targets significantly down. We were going to significantly target the warm-up phase of the RDE cycle, and we were really going to start to narrow in and reduce these down to very close to zero emissions, almost to the point that I think the viewpoint we held when we heard some of these was that ICE as a standalone propulsion system wouldn't be able to meet Euro 7, and it would require at least some form of electrification on every vehicle. I think the industry has, in the last year or couple of years, shifted away from the requirement that Euro 7 needs to be sort of leading this drive to zero emissions. There's other things at play here. We've got the fleet CO2 targets that are happening in Europe, which obviously drives a lot of the electrification we're seeing on the short term. And then there's obviously this move in 2035 towards the ban effectively of combustion engines, where we will have to be running zero emission vehicles. So I think there's other things at play here. And I think what the regulators have almost looked at is, I like to think of it as a do what we can now approach. So I know there's been some rumblings of people saying we shouldn't be doing this. It's, we need to be concentrating our resources and our investment into achieving full battery electric vehicles on the road. I think what they've tried to do with this announcement is say, well, what can we do? So, Kartik in a minute, I'm sure we'll run through what's actually in the standard. But if you think about sub 23 nanometer particles, it's been spoken about for a long time. We know that the technology is there, that we can effectively eliminate that, at least on the exhaust tailpipe, and there's some other bits that we can talk about in a minute, but we know it's there. We should do it, and we can do it. So why shouldn't we bring some sort of legislation in now, in the meantime, between now and 2035, that starts to tackle some of these? And every bit of improvement we can make to reduce the emissions output of these vehicles, we should be doing. And I think that's what Euro 7 has tried to do here. Kartik, I touched a little bit on it there. Maybe you can just run us through, what's in the standard, some of the key highlight takeaways of what that has been announced.
Sure, Mike. Thank you for that. So, as Mike mentioned, it was a long-awaited, emission legislation standard that had to come in place to meet the necessary targets that have been put across. So what primarily has, been different from Euro 6 in comparison has been the emission limits. So what has been done right now is that there is the fuel neutrality and technology neutrality factor that has been brought in, because in the past we have seen that there have been different legislative targets for a gasoline vehicle and maybe a different one for diesel. But now what has been done is everything has been brought under a single umbrella. And when we compare it to Euro 6, the lower of the emissions observed for either gasoline or diesel has been carried over as the next target for Euro 7. If I give you an example, in case of carbon monoxide, in Euro 6 for gasoline, it was close to 1,000 milligrams. And for diesel, it was 500. And now, since it's fuel neutral, 500 has been set as a target for both kinds of fuels. And when we talk about the standards as a whole, there have been instances where, apart from, say, the traditional pollutants that we used to monitor in the past, such as NOx, carbon monoxide, particulate number, and hydrocarbons, there is an added emphasis on looking at ammonia and the formaldehyde as well. And in parallel, there has been a view into the particulate emission from brakes and tires. So what this has basically done is, in a way, introduced how, say, other vehicles that are deemed to be the future, such as battery electric vehicles, could also be potentially looked into when it comes to emissions from the vehicle. And when we talk about something like real driving emissions, to keep a better or stricter eye on it, what has been done now is the operating range, which in the past was pretty narrow, has been widened from -10 degrees to 45 degrees now. And keeping more real world usage in pattern in mind, short distance driving is also being considered. So anything under 10 kilometers is also something that will be monitored. And as a whole, if we see up to Euro 6, it was assumed that compliance has to be necessary for durability up to 100k kilometers and 5 years in Europe. But now this has been further stretched to 200k kilometers and a period of 10 years, as there have been observations that the average car life is much higher than what it was assumed to be in case of Euro 6.
Okay. And Mike, would you say that this is kind of less stringent or maybe more stringent than what you were expecting from these announcements?
Yeah, I think so. I think I touched on it earlier. It's definitely less stringent than what we're expecting. It's still got its challenges. The removal of conformity factors is something that's going to be a challenge for OEMs. I think some of the targets are achievable, and I touched upon it earlier around, we thought potentially there was a move that a standalone ICE wouldn't be enough. I think now there will be some OEMs who've got combustion engines that will be capable of getting through some of these cycles and some of this, which we can have a separate discussion on whether that's right or wrong. But I think there's potential now. It will require some recalibration. It will require potentially some additional technology, which we can again touch upon in a later section. But definitely it's less stringent. I think one thing to say on what they've done, in my view, and where the biggest challenge is probably going to come on all of this is actually homologating all of these vehicles in the time frame. So the implementation now is going to be in 2025. We always heard potentially it would be around 2027, and it tends to be sort of a 4 or 5 year development cycle when these announcements are made. This is, well, effectively two and a half years now. We're nearly at the end of 22, so 2.5 years to recalibrate, fit in whatever. If you do need new technology, fit that into the vehicle, recalibrate your engine, your vehicle output, and then homologate that. That is a very, very challenging time constraint that's being put on OEMs here. So less stringent than what we were perhaps expecting. I understand the reasons. I think the big challenge now for OEMs is how they're going to homologate all of this in the next couple of years.
Yeah. And so what have people in the industry been saying about this? Are people happy about the targets? As you say, they're less stringent than you were initially expecting, but is this certainly something that people feel is achievable?
So the first impressions since the announcements have come out have been positive, because although the limitations have been lowered a bit, but it has not been lowered to a significant extent as it was being discussed in the past. So this in a way has set up a base that the current existing technology with, say, minor modifications could potentially be enough to meet the necessary targets, instead of having, say, a heavy investment coming into R&D and technology, where such extreme targets would be met then. So most of the first impressions have been pretty decent, and it's been pretty positive, and they indicate that with a system such as a gasoline system, the possibility of GPF being used was already pretty high, and probably using this further is good enough to meet the necessary targets that have been put in place. And similarly, in case of diesel engines, there is a possibility that electric catalysts could be integrated into the current system with the very minor cost implications, and such vehicles then could be able to meet the necessary targets of the Euro 7 standards. And since the durability part also covers the fact that up to 200K kilometers are to be covered in such vehicles, this probably extends the life of the vehicle, which in a way also indicates that the resale value of these vehicles over a period of time is also going to be pretty good, as a lot of consumers would be able to run this for a long period of time.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think the once we understand that we need an emission standard, I think Karthik's right. The perception has been reasonably positive, apart from probably the time frame. I think there is big question marks around how OEMs are going to achieve this in this homologation. I think you probably see some standout headlines. I know Ford released a statement late last week, I think it was, and we've also heard from Carlos Tavares, the CEO at Stellantis, around why are we even bothering with this. It's no matter what level of investment is required into it, it's investment that's detracting away from zero emission vehicles and from our path to battery electric. So yeah, I think the industry, once we understand that we need this, I think probably the engineering and is this achievable level, it's positive. I think there's still some high level questions around, should we be putting in another emission standard? I think I explained earlier some of the reasons why I believe they've done it. We have to do something. We have to keep chipping away at this. We can't just wait 12, 13 years to get to 2035. But yeah, on the whole, it's been reasonably positive. Can we achieve it level? I think there's still the question mark reading some articles around, if we actually look at the entire park, the entire on-road fleet that we've got, Euro 6D vehicles aren't really the major issue we've got on the road. It's how we get some of these older vehicles, Euro 5 or even beyond, earlier than that, how do we get those off the road? And that challenge still remains, and that's going to be a challenge that needs to be tackled over the next 10, 20, if not more years, depending on how quickly we can do that. So yeah, that's one thing that's still being discussed and has been raised quite emphatically at this point, is we need to start thinking about tackling that, as well as just these new vehicles being produced.
Yeah, sure. It's very much a significant portion of the market. It's not something that can be forgotten. It's all fine and well, making new vehicles that roll off the production line much better, but we've still got to consider the fact that there's so many used vehicles on the market. So just circling back round to the point of new vehicles, what is the knock-on effect on technology from this? How is it going to change the vehicles that are coming onto the market?
So as I mentioned, it is expected that say very minimal technological improvement would be needed. And as a point that Mike put out, recalibration is something that has, say, majority of the work that will cover over the next, say, 2 years probably, before the homologation has to be carried out, because with minor additions such as an electrically heated catalyst or just possibly the addition of a GPF, these targets could potentially be achieved. But yes, the part where you need to homologate it and maybe even prove the durability is where a major chunk of the time would be occupied for OEMs and suppliers. And once this is possible, then I think the target of 2025 could be met. But yeah, it's everything is in a very compressed timeline right now, and that's the biggest challenge that everyone is looking forward to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think in terms of some of the more specific technologies, I know you've touched upon GPF. I took a look in our data set for Euro 6D in 2022 at least. 88% of the vehicles rolling off the production line are running the GPF anyway. So it's a small number of additional catalysts there for really the MFI engines, I guess, is what's the last knockings that we have to have. ECAT was always a technology that was under discussion. I think this perhaps doesn't detract away from that market. I still think, like commercial diesel, is still going to require potentially an ECAT on some of the warm-up, depending on the weight and the size of engine, etc. But I think it's more around, does every vehicle require a form of electrification now to meet it? I think we've perhaps, you may be able to get through as a standalone ICE, The recalibration is definitely one, but the other technology, which probably lives a little bit outside of my remit as a previous engineer, is how they're going to capture some of this brake particle emissions that's now part of it. I will be intrigued to see some of the solutions that suppliers and OEMs come up with to capture the brake particles and the tire degradation as well. So yeah, an interesting one to come on technology there on that front, I think, in the next couple of years.
So for the average consumer that maybe isn't so privy to these regulations and things like that, what does this mean? So let's say, for example, I'm looking to buy a new car and I don't know anything about the Euro 7 regulations, and what's going to change for me in terms of the car, in terms of my experience and things like that in the future?
I think that the be all and end all answer of that, now that we've seen the regulations been announced, is it's going to be fairly minimal, I would assume. I think there was previously some discussion around the complexity on the exhaust could have quite a knock-on effect on the price of the vehicle that you would need to then pay. I don't think we're probably in that remit. I don't think it's going to be a huge knock-on effect for consumers from a standard just bolting on technology perspective. I don't think it will be that significant. I guess the next steps will be whether there's anything around low emission zones, expansion of those, but I don't think it's going to be a huge knock-on effect for consumers when we do get to Euro 7. Potential, some of these other solutions, like I say, on brake particles and how you can measure the tire degradation as well, that could have a knock-on effect depending what you need to do. I don't know if it's going to be some sort of filter technology like a DPF or a GPF, and then you've obviously got to empty that at some point. With the exhaust, it's relatively straightforward to do that. We've got solutions in place. How they'll do that on the brake system, I don't know. So yeah, the knock-on effect, I don't think it's going to be too significant, but there will obviously be a little bit of impact for everyone and potentially a little bit more cost on the vehicle, but I don't think we're looking at huge on costs for the end consumer.
Yeah, adding on to Mike's point, so the European Commission suggests that the added cost is somewhere between, say, 90 to 150 euros. So it is not that significant. And they do also put out that for every euro that the OEM or the supplier spends, there is more than 5 euros that is saved on health and environment. So this is something that could potentially be seen as a very, say, insignificant impact on the consumer with a lot of benefits.
Yeah, and I know there is also something as well. I was reading around how if you can go above and beyond the level of, if you just meet the target, yes, you're Euro 7 compliant, but there's also going to be something around, and I'm not sure how they'll do it just yet, but if you can go above and beyond, there'll be sort of tiers of how well you're achieving Euro 7, shall we say, and your vehicle will get some sort of add-on criteria, just how it gets. Yeah, there'll be a knock-on criteria of, your vehicle will be, ultra Euro 7 compliant or something like that potentially. So yeah, I know there is talk that there could be something like that as well.
So is this the last of the standards that are going to come out in Europe, or are we expecting to see updated versions of this? And just to build on that, what about the rest of the world? Are they going to follow suit with what we're doing here?
So I think in terms of Europe, my gut feel is yes, this probably will be the last one because of how much there is a real rapid drive to get to battery electric in Europe. That's not to say that they don't take this same approach where, we discovered that we can do something and we should do something on a certain piece of emission, certain output emission that we need to tackle in the next couple of years before, say, 2030. I wouldn't rule out, say, a Euro 7B or something like that, but I think it's unlikely now. I think this will probably be the last big emission standard, at least here in Europe.
Yes, so as Mike mentioned, with the 2035 ban also in the picture, this definitely seems to be the last one in Europe. But when we talk about the rest of the world, there is a possibility in China where CN7 could see a push once Euro 7 since Euro 7 has come out. And when we talk about other parts of the world, countries that usually follow Euro 6D could also try to make this jump to Euro 7. And in case of North America, there is a possibility since there a couple of months back there was an announcement on the Advanced Clean Car 2 regulations by CARB, and as more and more states are aligning with CARB, there is a possibility that with this mandate where 100% ZEVs are expected by 2035, there could be a tightening of emissions in North America based on what we have just observed for Euro 7.
Okay, great. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So a big thank you to Michael and Kartik for joining Autology and sharing your insights. And a big thank you to all of our listeners as well for tuning in. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@spglobal.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all of the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now and have a great day.